Do-do-do-do. Welcome back to Tax Fun with Taxium, the podcast that dares to ask the really big questions like, are you sure that exemption certificate is valid? I'm your host, Amanda, here with my co-host, Ronald, the only person I know who can recite the sales tax matrix of Texas from memory. Ronald, are you ready to talk about exemptions today?
Oh, no. I mean, yes, if you're going to force me to.
Well, in today's episode, we're talking all about sales tax exemptions, one of the most misunderstood areas of compliance. We'll break it down into three parts, as we usually do. What are exemptions, when to use exemptions, and of course, what are the pitfalls? Because while exemptions might seem like a way to simplify tax, they can actually create huge liabilities if you get them wrong. So let's start at the beginning. What do we mean when we say sales tax exemptions?
Yeah, in general, the state's position is that a company should be assessing and probably paying tax on a lot of transactions. So exemptions are your proof, your reason, your rationale as to why your company didn't issue the state sales tax dollars on a specific product, service, invoice.
Okay, so just to be clear, not charging tax, does that mean it's a free pass?
No, not at all. And to give folks some historical background for the folks watching on YouTube, I'm going to share my screen. But before, when it came to physical nexus, economic nexus, the states were mostly concerned about the taxable sales. But as they expand their search for revenue, they've become more increasingly aware of the non-taxable sales. So in the past, this used to be most states were gray and didn't care about non-taxable sales. But now most states are orange in that they care about these non-taxable sales. So it's super important for businesses to be aware of all this because it applies to the exemption stuff. Because just because you're collecting an exempt certificate and not paying the sales tax doesn't remove some of the other obligations around nexus and filing. So it's ultra important that as you're going through this exemption process with folks, the certificate collection, that you keep your house in order because all these things connect to each other now.
Yeah, absolutely. So should we move on to when to use the sales tax exemptions?
Yeah, for sure. And that's an easy one, right? I mean, at some point, it's going to come up in the conversation between buyer and seller that somebody's exempt. Hopefully, both parties are bringing this proactively. Both parties are responsible for managing their portion of sales or use tax. And so both parties got to make sure that, hey, if you're exempt, tell the person, your vendor, that you're exempt. Get them a certificate. Don't wait till you've already purchased it to then try and fix it afterwards. Same thing from the seller. Sometimes vendors forget. So make it part of your process. And we're going to talk about, I think, in the next couple episodes, but how to make processes out of this stuff. To make it part of your standard daily routine when you're having folks requesting invoices, just ask them, hey, are y'all exempt? Great. What kind of exemption, send me what you got, and if it's valid, we'll apply it. But the when is ideally before any money is exchanged, because part of the state requirements is that you're supposed to verify the certificate, get your eyes and hands on it, make sure it's valid in the jurisdiction in question before giving them the $0 tax due. But yeah, time of the sale right before is when it should come up.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a general rule, if you're not collecting tax, you'd better have the right supporting documentation on file.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Let's roll through a couple of scenarios just to give a better understanding to those who are listening and or watching. Example one, the reseller. A shoe store buys inventory from a distributor. They give the distributor a resale certificate and the distributor does not collect tax, which makes sense, but the tax will be collected later when the shoes are sold to consumers.
Right.
But if the shoe store doesn't provide that certificate, the distributor may be liable for uncollected tax during an audit.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, how often do you see businesses skip the part where they actually collect the resale certificate and just assume they're covered?
All the time, for sure. And, we keep teasing some of these other episodes, but we're going to talk about more how to operationalize and scale some of this stuff. But, that's the hard part of all this. It's not asking Amanda, hey, Amanda, are you exempt? That's an easy thing to do as a one-off. It's doing this every single time for every single exempt sale, hundreds and thousands of times a year, asking, collecting, verifying it. And I'm going to show you my screen because a lot of companies are using some of the multi-state forms, which is fine to some degree, but people have come to kind of think that there's magic bullets out there, and there's just not. All this requires a lot of legwork, even with some of these little mini shortcuts. Um, and then on the MTC site themselves, they tell you basically, sure, we're giving you the certificate that we're saying is able to be used in all these states, but also if you have questions, go talk to the state. Right. So it's not 100% use this all the time. Your problems are solved. It's like, well, okay, there's a lot of asterisks. So here's a good starting point, but here you go. And that's the danger of all this is that, you got to get it exactly right. Because when push comes to shove and, the piper comes around, it's not, well, I went to MTC and they said this and they said that. They're not going to care. It's like, well, you're selling in my backyard. You should know my rules. You don't have the right documentation. You're paying that tax on behalf of your customer.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing to note on that too is that just because you have a resale certificate does not mean you are fully exempt, depending on where it is that you are selling into.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, pop quiz for you. I think connected to this, there's different kinds of exemptions. Can you name some and give some examples?
Yeah. So there are typically three separate kinds of exemptions. The first one is entity based, which is based on who the buyer is. The second one is use based, based on how the product is used. And the third one is product based, which is based on what's being sold.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, tell us more.
Okay, so some examples of entity-based exemptions would cover nonprofits, government agencies, schools and religious organizations, and businesses buying for resale.
Mm-hmm.
Use-based exemptions would apply when the item is being used in qualifying activity, so like manufacturing, agriculture, research and development, that farm equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the product-based exemptions, for example, some states are exempt groceries, medical devices, or digital products. But just because something is exempt in one state doesn't mean it's exempt in another.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, do you have a favorite, but it's exempt in my state story to share?
Nothing specific around that, but I did want to talk about something you just brought up, the different types around some of the entities. And, again, part of the difficulty of this is just all the information and getting it exactly right. But I'm glad you brought that up because just because an entity, should be exempt in some cases doesn't mean it always is. Or it's super important to kind of start with what you talked about. Why are they exempt, right? What's their general exemption reason? Are they a church, a school? Are they a manufacturer, or reseller? Great. What's being sold in relation to this? Is it being consumed as part of this? Is it just for resale? Is it being used by the church? Is the church reselling it, right?
Yeah.
Is it printed materials that the church is using or whatever the organization is? So people got to kind of dive in, and then going back to that MTC thing, any questions, call the state because there's no magic blanket, magic bullet. It's going to just cover everything. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up on the entity side. Because another part of that is these things, exemption certificates will also expire at different points in time in different states, depending on the reason they're exempt. In some places, an educational organization may be exempt for eternity. Other places, they may have to get a new certificate every 4 years, but it's more on, well, it's equally on both the buyer and the seller, but you just can't rely on the other party and assume that they're doing it properly. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because folks got to be aware of those different types and make sure they're getting the right information at the right cadence.
Yeah. And on that same note, even some states don't have exemptions for things like schools and religious organizations or hospitals. So just because they give you an exemption doesn't mean that you're necessarily exempt in that place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. At least the next one around some of the use stuff, it's like organizations to be exempt for a variety of reasons, but then based on the use of the product, that could dictate that specific invoice product isn't taxable in that scenario. Something else for folks to be aware of.
Yeah. So how do you coach clients through making sure they're applying the exemption to the right type of purchase?
Yeah, we talked about committing to do this right, admitting what you know and what you don't know. And if you're not confident, go ask somebody. You wouldn't start having a convo about sales tax and know any of this stuff we're talking about, nor would you start the convo with this stuff. But as you explore more things, ask questions. Maybe the first time you get an exempt certificate is what caused you to look into something like this. But if you don't know, dig into it, find resources, find help, come to hang out with Taxi and we'll coach you through this, or your CPA or accountant, or whoever you trust with your tax and finance stuff. But hopefully somebody in your circle knows information that you don't and can get you started down this path. But that's the first part, just kind of asking questions and, seeing what the states say and then go and find more resources as you need them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ronald, do you think that we should give a couple more scenarios, or should we just jump right in? Okay. So my second scenario would be a nonprofit purchase. A nonprofit buys office furniture. They provide a valid 501(c)(3) exemption certificate, and you don't charge tax. But, and here's a big but, some states require the exemption to be tied to the use of the item. So if the furniture is used for a commercial cafe the nonprofit runs, that might be taxable. So,
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And this is why it's great to have experts on your side and resources available, because even with the tools to assess tax, it's not as simple as, because QuickBooks wouldn't know that.
right.
So you just got to have people that have exposure and expertise to help you work through this stuff. Because again, if you get audited, I didn't know is not an excuse. This is too hard and too complicated. That's a perfect example of that.
I feel like that's a sentence that we will say a lot in this podcast is I didn't know is not an excuse.
For sure. For sure.
There are plenty of resources. So make sure you're asking those questions and looking for those answers before you're just blindly applying things that could come back to bite you later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my last scenario is on manufacturing equipment.
Okay.
A business buys a new machine to use on the production line. They claim a manufacturing exemption, which is only valid if the machine is used directly in producing goods for sale. So you'll need a state-specific exemption form, sometimes an affidavit describing the use, and you may need it to renew annually.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I was just looking at the Texas website, and exactly like you said, sometimes depending on if it's being used in that process and how can affect the taxability of it. But yeah, definitely something to be aware of as you're dealing with this stuff. Asking the right questions, making sure, because if you don't ask the right questions, you're not going to get the right answers. And people come and go in companies. And so it's, especially when you're selling stuff, it's ultra important having that process in place to cover your bases, because you just can't assume that your purchaser on the other end is going to be in the know well enough to give you what you need proactively. Maybe they're new to the company. Maybe they don't know if that place is supposed to be exempt. Maybe they're filling in for somebody. So it'd be good for y'all just to have your bases covered and, make sure you have a good understanding of what am I responsible for in this kind of scenario. So that was a good one.
Absolutely. That brings me to our next segment, which would be pitfalls of the sales tax exemptions. So this is where the fun begins. What can go wrong with exemptions? And the short answer to that is a lot. So let's talk through the top pitfalls that trip people up, kind of like words.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest, I don't know if it's a pitfall, but there's only one outcome to doing this wrong, and that's your company is going to pay the sales tax on behalf of that buyer.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of folks I would talk to, I tell them to start there. Look at your average purchase price on these exempt sales. Look at how many of these items or units or invoices you have a year, and that's your exposure. If you're doing 5 sales a year worth $2 million, those 4 certificates you should have are worth 500 grand a piece effectively.
Yes.
Folks should start with a high level understanding of what's our exposure for doing this wrong. And that should hopefully encourage them to go figure out how to do this right. Because if you've got $10, $20 in exempt sales, you can manage on your own well enough. But for folks doing a ton of business through exempt sales, you really got to have process, tools, something in place to make sure that your hiney is covered, because that's a lot of dollars sitting out there to have to pay tax on behalf of somebody.
Right. Yeah, I would say a big one is not collecting a certificate at all. That's typically the biggest
Mhm.
issue when it comes to exemptions, but realistically, no certificate equals no protection. So if the state audits you and they ask you why you didn't collect tax and you can't produce a valid exemption certificate, you're the one that's on the hook.
Exactly, for sure. And this is the danger in a way with some technology sometimes. We all love invoicing systems, but they're not designed to manage tax and be your tax source of truth.
Mhm.
Any invoicing system, QuickBooks, Shopify, BigCommerce, any ERP, there's usually a button you can push to exempt that account or that client from tax. And when you hit it, it exempts them for all time, for eternity, because it's not designed to actually manage an exempt certificate. So most businesses, when they click that little field in QuickBooks, nobody thinks to go and check, well, oh crap, is this a resale certificate that expires every couple of years in Illinois or California or wherever? Is it in a church exemption, an educational exemption that never expires? Yeah, they just click the button. They don't think about it. Audit time comes around and like, well, you did this resale transaction 3 years ago in Minnesota. Where's the certificate? Why are they exempt? How do you know they're exempt? And people are like, well, I don't know. I clicked the button and somebody clicked the button in QuickBooks, and we assumed that they were exempt, and not a good look to have. So you want to have a way to keep things proactively in order, so these questions are much easier to answer after the fact.
Absolutely.
Cool. Go
Yes. Oh, I was going to say another good example of that when you go into your ERP and you either check that checkbox or you put in an exempt number or something is like we stated before, depending on the exemption type and the state that it's going into, it
ahead.
could either not be an exempt reason that's accepted in that state, or some states will have partial exemptions based on what it is that either what you're selling or the exemption type. So,
Mhm.
as an example, in the state of California, agriculture and industrial production only apply a partial exemption.
Mhm.
Whereas in Hawaii, the only two exempt reasons that are completely exempt are federal government and foreign diplomat. Everything else comes with an excise tax.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. So much to deal with.
Oh,
So I got something else to show you. I've always found this amusing too. I was thinking about some of the multi-state forms again.
hmm
Couldn't find this earlier, but now I did. So there's, like 38 states on that form, but just because they're on the form doesn't mean that you can use it universally. So Illinois doesn't allow the form to be used for resale. Connecticut only allows the form to be used for resale. And then Kansas doesn't allow the form for purchasing construction materials. But, all these things where it's not rocket science, but it's a level of information you got to wade through to make sure you're doing this stuff properly is crazy. So just tread carefully.
yeah. We want to say, gotta love the US government, right?
I feel like we need a good stiff drink now after all this.
It is a lot, isn't
Mhm.
it?
What else we got for them?
Another pitfall would be accepting incomplete or expired forms, which we kind of touched over.
Yeah.
I would say what we see the most of is that forms are missing fields. They don't have a signature or a date on them, or they're using a certificate that's expired or accepting the certificate from the wrong state, which, as you just showed, is not great.
For sure.
Do you have a checklist for reviewing a certificate before accepting it?
Um, Not a specific certificate checklist, but more of a process around how to accept them. But it's basically ask for it, ahead of every sale just to be ultra safe. And then you want to hear what they say. Great, Amanda, you're exempt because of resale. And then when you say that, I know what to look for in the certificate. I'm looking for a resale certificate,
Mhm.
or a government exemption type certificate, but it needs to match the reason. Like you said a minute ago, I've seen too often where they say, oh, yeah, we're exempt because of XYZ. And they give you some other kind of documentation that's not a resale certificate or
Right.
not government exemption. So just be sure that what they're telling you matches what they give you, matches what the state will accept for not taxing, in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was a really good call out to ask for one before every sale, because one thing that we didn't cover is single use certificates.
Mhm. Oh yeah. There's so many, like, we could spend hours upon hours upon hours talking about this, but yeah, definitely start by asking, because most of your buyers should be aware they need to give an exempt certificate for their use case. It's unlikely that's the first time they've heard about it. So yeah, don't be afraid to say, hey, just by the way, you said you're exempt. Where's your certificates?
Right.
I really need this before I process a transaction, just to verify, because I don't want Uncle Sam coming to punish me for your room being messy.
Yeah, then don't afraid to be tough. If you're
Yeah.
not gonna provide the certificate, you're gonna be charged sales tax. It's just the way
Yeah.
that it goes.
hmm And if they don't like that, send them Amanda's way. Should be tough for them.
We'll kill him with kindness.
Yeah.
Uh, I
What is kindness? Can I pour that in my drink?
don't think you should. You probably don't wanna drink kindness. Just sweat it out your pores. Okay, so when it comes to storing your certificates properly, you need a process. So exemption certificates should be stored digitally. Words are hard. They should be easy to find during the event of an audit, and they should be reviewed regularly for renewal. So, do you have a favorite tool or system for managing exemption certificates across multiple states?
Let's punt this forward an episode or two, because I think this is a great something to dive into around the scalability, how to build a process around all this stuff. That's going to be part tools and then part people processes. And then the tools have a function of the people and the processes. But yeah, let's punt this one a little bit, but definitely something we want to dive into. That's super important.
Sure, sales tax exemptions part 2.
Yeah. Or maybe we'll be like around the how to build a scalable set of processes and then
Yeah.
we use or something like that. We'll find some amazing, funny, hilarious title.
Yes. So, okay. So, what's your advice to businesses who feel awkward asking longtime customers for updated certificates?
To me, that's the easy part. It's getting the first one that's difficult. But once you've already both kind of understood that they need to be giving it to you, you need to be reviewing it every so often. And just, it's kind of on you at that point to have a reminder of the cadence, but they should be used to it. Hey, thanks for getting it to me 2 years ago, 4 years ago. Now it's time for a new one.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that you want to shout out?
Just a little recap, just for folks to take something home with. Just if I could leave with a couple things, just always go through and make sure you've understood the reason why these folks are thinking they're exempt. Get the documentation to verify it, that it matches. And like Amanda said, find a way to store it somewhere in case you need to find it later. It's easily findable.
Yeah. I think you summarized that recap really well.
Thanks.
Absolutely. All right. So, we have to go with the obligatory joke for the day, right? Or of the week. Why did the exemption certificate break up with a sales tax invoice?
Why?
Because it said, it's not you, it's state law.
Oh, I'm going to use that.
All right, so that's it for this week on Tax Fun with Taxiam. If you've ever accepted a certificate on a handshake, or if you're wondering if your certs are audit ready, now's the time to review. We'll be back next week with another exciting installment of tax education, stories from the trenches, and the occasional state portal horror story. Until then, stay curious, stay compliant, and keep it tax fun.
Awesome. So excited. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye, y'all. Oh, don't forget to check out the website. The podcast is on there as well. Taxing.com/podcast. And let us know if you have any questions around sales tax, Avalar, or otherwise. Thanks, everybody.